Hi everyone, it's Jen again, and I am finally feeling well enough to show my face, so I think that I'm finally getting over this respiratory illness, which makes me really happy. I have been able to still plug away at writing a little bit every day this past week, but that's pretty much all I've been doing. That's pretty much all there is left for Mission 10. Since I've already finished the sprites, the background art, the skill trigger animations that I need to get done for the art assets. I always front load that when it comes to the beginning of the month. I don't know why. I guess when it comes to play testing, I like to have all the art assets, so it just seems like the natural task to take on. And of course, because I always save the writing for the second half of the month, I'm always looking forward to the first half of the month to get back into drawing. So that's been my week. I wanted to talk a little bit about varying your story structure. I think that when it comes to visual novels, the approach most people would traditionally go for would be something of having your label started in RenPy, having your scene started, having the conversation start, and then maybe giving the player some choice dialogue to direct them in a couple different paths. So in Mission 10, the beginning of Mission 10, you go to the war camp to prepare for the final battle, and the first player choice you get is to whether or not you want to initiate the whole war preparation scenes and then get locked into the war, or if you want to still be able to do other types of tasks such as building resources, doing bond conversations and bond leveling and gifting, and any of those things that you won't be able to do anymore once the war has started. So that would be like a menu dialogue, is whether or not you want to initiate the lock into the war scenario, or if you want to have the freedom to kind of keep going about the free roaming in this game. And then I had a choice, I guess, as the writer, whether or not I wanted to continue with this kind of very straightforward kind of storytelling where the characters all just kind of one by one have their little discussions with the player character before you're getting ready for the war, because the real purpose of this scene in the camp is not so much story driven, because the war scenario, as far as tactics and I guess the more linear parts of the story, are going to be part of the in-between wave war battles, is when you're kind of deploying your units and fighting. Then you'll be having a pretty straightforward dialogue with your party members as to the progress of the war, how they're reacting to the enemy, all that kind of stuff that I guess would be the necessary information for the scenes, the necessary information for the player to read to drive the story forward, to make the events progress. These scenes that I wanted to have in the war camp were going to be more for establishing those character relationships with the player that are not mandatory for understanding the overall story arc. So I could just have this kind of campfire way of just lining up the different characters and having them each have their little character moment where they have their little moment to shine, where they give their little quips and they share their feelings on how they feel about, you know, the upcoming events. Like, are they nervous? Are they excited for it? Are they reluctant? That type of thing. Which is, I would say, a viable choice. But I didn't feel like it gave the player as much interaction. It didn't feel, I guess, if I were to imagine myself in a camp, just kind of like wandering around, trying to pass time, because the scenario is that you arrive at the camp and then you're waiting for, depending on which side of the war you're on, you're either waiting for the queen to arrive or you're waiting for Asher before, you know, the final preparations are done. So I wanted to have this kind of sense of like waiting and like idleness, and then these just kind of random little conversations would like pop up between the player and the different characters to kind of just see how they deal with that anticipation. You know, whether they kind of busy themselves or they, you know, they're caught up in what last minute things they can do to try to prepare, depending on the character's personality. But they would all be optional conversations that you wouldn't necessarily have to read in order to understand and progress the story. It would just purely be for getting to know the characters better, rather than have them all just kind of approach either in a giant group or one by one and just kind of go through those motions. I wanted to give the player an opportunity to just kind of like wander around, I guess, if I imagined myself in this camp and trying to figure out like what I want to do with my time. So there's like 5 different activities that you can check on while you're in the camp. There's not that much to do because you're kind of stuck behind the fort walls, and so you have a hidden stat, which is just like every time you do an activity, it gives you like these camp points, and then when you eventually reach a certain number of camp points, then enough time passes where then, okay, now the queen's gonna arrive and the rest of the story's gonna unfold. And depending on how many times you do each activity will determine like who you run into and the types of activities that you do. And then it does eventually go to like a randomized, after you do an event like 3 times, it'll go to a random effect, a random unit, which will then have a little interaction with all the common units that don't have as much personality or character building as like the main characters, but I thought it would be still kind of fun to have them there to remember that they are kind of their own little person. They have their own little quirks and personalities as well. So I have a separate set of these like camp labels for each one of the characters. This particular one here is Basil. If you go over to check on the rations, then she kind of shows you this little trick for making them taste better. And later on, or I should say simultaneously, because she picks out the little like fibrous vegetable bits because she thinks they're bitter and they don't taste good. And then one of the other types of random conversations you can have with the generic Earth Knight, because he's sort of a tattletale in his like very short interactions that you have with him. He's complaining that somebody's wasting food by like tossing away like the vegetable parts. So there's some references within the conversations to what other characters are doing, to help it feel like you're all in one place and you're all sharing the same space, and what certain characters are doing or having an effect on the other characters in this camp that's very like tightly packed, and everybody's being kind of like restless and trying to figure out how to deal with this sort of pre-war anxiety. That's just kind of like, I guess, one way of thinking of how you can try to vary the way that different conversations are presented in order to mix things up a little bit for the player so that it doesn't feel like so straightforward and kind of like here's the same conversation layout, here's the same presentation of dialogue every time. For me, I assess like what the purpose of each piece of the writing is, and if it's something that the player does not have to know, I would rather them have a chance to know, or there be a set of conditions for them to know, so that it becomes a little bit like a scavenger hunt, that their reward is that they get to learn a little extra about the character. But if it's something that they don't want to do, then they can literally just sleep through this entire, you could just keep taking a nap until it's over. So I would hope that at this point the player would be invested enough in the characters, even like the little common unit characters like the Tattletale Earth Knight, that you would want to try to see as many of those types of conversations as you could. And maybe even some players who are particularly invested might even go back and replay this whole camp scenario just to see what, if I keep doing this one activity, will I eventually run into all the different common units and see what they're up to? Or, maybe even if I optimize like all the elite units, I might still like miss out on a few conversations. So I'd like to go back and like figure out where my favorite character is and make sure that I get their conversation and get to interact with them. So that is just another way that I try to make the players' choices have consequence without it being like this, oh, I need to use a walkthrough or else I'm going to get a bad ending kind of consequences. Like, there is some consequence to the actions, but they're not like game breaking or like having to restart unless you are the type of completionist who wants to like unlock every little bit of dialogue. The other kind of conditional conversation that I have in this camp scene is that once the evening passes, there is a bunch of optional scenes that will unlock depending on whether or not you are in a romance and have given an eternal pendant to any of the characters. And there's also variations of those dialogues depending on whether or not you have romanced multiple different characters, and if those multiple different characters, if it's more than like 2 characters, then that's also going to have an additional set of dialogue. Again, this is just fun kind of shenanigans that I feel like build character, build a sense of rapport with the companions, but is not necessary. You can go through the game without romancing any of the characters, without seeing any of this extra little fluffy dialogue. And I would say that you would still know the characters just as well. You just, I guess, missed out on this one little interaction. After the nighttime dialogue, I start getting into the war campaign, where again we start going to something more linear. This is actually just filler because I haven't written this war scenario dialogue yet, so I just have some filler stuff here that was from the last war that I'm just using to remind myself of like what my structure is for this type of dialogue. But then we also have these sort of like beginning randomized quips. So I have a list that's populated depending on what units you've deployed, and that's how I randomly select for an elite to do the kind of like start dialogue for the battle and the win or loss animation and dialogue. So I'm using that same list to pull an extra little starter dialogue that they say during the wars to just again give a little bit more sense that the characters are aware that this is not just some random I'm trying to earn 100 gold type battle, like that they're aware that they're in a very serious war that has very serious potential consequences, and to hopefully reinforce that to the player that this is not just another randomized battle, that we are doing this for a reason that's very important to these characters. We're also going to have special extra win and loss dialogues with those starter quips whenever there is an elite enemy involved, which I've spread them out more in this battle. At least that's what the plan is. I still have to play test and see if the difficulty is around where I want it to be. Well, I think that's all I've got for this week. If you've got any tips or advice or feedback to these suggestions or this approach to kind of varying the presentation of dialogue, let me know. And as always, if you're working on something, best wishes to you, and don't forget to enjoy the process. Bye now.